My name's Sarah Arthurs. I live in Calgary. Joel and I have met one another through various circles in the city, and I'm with New Scoop YYC, which is a news co-op in Calgary that does generative journalism based on appreciative inquiry, where we look for things that are going well. So creating the world we want through the stories we tell, which is part of our attraction to the work of the Flourishing Congregations Institute. So we're really happy to be partnering with Joel around this. So Joel, I will let you jump in and kind of introduce yourself and take us into this topic, speaking around organizational ethos. And then we'll, after Joel's spoken for a bit, we'll break out and give a chance for everybody else on the call to introduce themselves, and we'll start some dialogue. So Joel, I think that's all we need to cover at this stage.
Perfect. Thanks, Sarah. And just so I clarify, Sarah, a little bit of housekeeping here. Do you want to do group introductions with all of us together, or do you still want to do breakout groups?
I think with this number, we'll do it all together.
Okay, sounds good. So maybe I'll just tell you a little bit about the Institute and myself, and then would love to hear from everyone around the screen here, a little bit of background as well. But yes, my name is Joel Thiessen. I am Professor of Sociology at Ambrose University in Calgary, Alberta. I'm starting, I guess, in the middle of my 10th year on faculty here, and also the director of the Flourishing Congregations Institute, which is a new research institute that we launched in the last couple of years here at Ambrose. And our central purpose or aim is to provide good Canadian data on Canadian congregations, and specifically, where are the signs of life and vitality within Christian congregations? Catholic, mainline, conservative Protestant congregations have been our focus to this point. And we're trying to understand, where are those signs of life and vitality? What can we learn from these congregations and settings? And how can we understand tradition-specific orientations? So does flourishing, for example, look similar or different in a Catholic context than it does in, say, a Presbyterian or Anglican or Pentecostal setting, and so forth? What can we learn about congregations that are larger or smaller, rural, urban, church plants, congregations that have been around 100 years? I think we're certainly trying to wade into these kinds of waters. So the Institute is designed to research congregations across the country and to understand these signs of life and vitality. We are a research team. I am one of four. We have a couple other colleagues here at Ambrose University, Dr. Arch Wong and Dr. Bill McAlpine in the areas of practical theology, and then Dr. Keith Walker at the University of Saskatchewan, who works in areas of leadership and organizations. A few, I guess, kind of self-plug things for the Institute. If you're not aware, I would encourage you to check out our website, with a small caveat that we are unveiling a new website in the next couple of days, but flourishingcongregations.org. You can check that out. You can learn a bit more about the Institute. You can also, I'd encourage you to sign up for updates if you want to learn more about what kinds of resources are out there, what kind of research are we doing, including a book that we just put out this last year based on some of our initial findings as an institute last year. And then you can track with us on some of our social media avenues on Twitter and Facebook and so forth. So that's a little bit about me, a little bit about the Institute, and looking forward today to sharing a little bit about some of the things that we've learned and then engaging you in conversations. So I think it might be helpful to go around the screen here and have everyone introduce themselves, say a little bit about your own background and connection to this particular topic. And I know personally, I know some of you around the screen, but you may not know one another. So maybe we'll pass it off to Susan, and no relation so far as I know, based on last name, but I guess we're about to find out. So Susan, we'll hand it over to you.
Hello, Susan. Would you be willing to introduce yourself and who's at your site? Okay. We're not hearing you right now. So I'm not sure what's happened there.
It looks like a bandwidth issue, which if you want a little hint, might be to kill the video for a second if it's short on bandwidth.
Thanks, Graham. Susan, could you just turn off your video for a bit? So maybe we'll just hear your voice if you click along the bottom. Is that making a difference? We still can't hear you. Okay, so a suggestion, Susan, would be there is a chat option at the bottom. Perhaps you could just chat and share kind of who you are, where you are, and I know there are 3 other people there with you on site, so perhaps you could start with that. Thank you. Lucille, would you be willing to introduce yourself? Hi.
Hi, okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
My name's Lucille Otero. I'm from Saskatoon. I'm a Roman Catholic. I just was awarded my PhD degree this past Saturday at the U of S All Convocation in Educational Administration and Leadership. My area of research was adult religious education and faith formation in Roman Catholic context, particularly Roman Catholic. I essentially looked at the parish as an educational organization. I'm acquainted with Dr. Walker. He's a professor in my department. He was one of my PhD profs. And I became aware of the Flourishing Congregation's website and their work, and I signed up. Particularly in the Roman Catholic context, there's like next to no research in Canada. I found that out as I was doing my own work. So I think the kind of work that Flourishing Congregations is engaged in, from what I've seen, because I'm on the mailing list, is actually really interesting, and I think has a lot to contribute to Canadian-based research. I'll be honest, I'm not really familiar with other Christian denominations within Canada. I'm Roman Catholic, but with that, I do have an ecumenical framework, so anyway, that's. As I said, I just made a couple of notes here. Yeah, so that's my area of interest. So I think in the Catholic context, we are having there's many challenges from my perspective, particularly in our parishes. I know in the Protestant context, you'll call them congregations or whatever, but yeah, there's, issues relating to leadership, particularly faith formation, and particularly for adults. And that was the focus of my area, because my background's in adult education. So anyway, that's it in a nutshell.
Thanks, Lucille.
Thank you.
Great. Carolyn, if you'd like to speak next and introduce yourself. Okay. Okay, there. Okay, you're good now? No, you're not. We can't hear you, Carolyn. So it looks like that's a little, we can hear some crackle, but not really you. Okay, I think there's probably something in your connection with maybe your headphones that's not working. So maybe if you just talk directly into the computer and unplug your headphones, it might work better. Okay, Graham, we'll move to you because we know that you know how to do this.
Hello, everybody. Welcome. Hello from Montreal. My name is Graham Singh. I'm a priest in the Anglican Church, and my wife and I were based in the UK for 14 years, where we were involved in the closing and reopening of historic church buildings. And this is the 4th project that we've worked on as a family here in Montreal. And that work has coincided with an invitation, an opportunity to speak into that issue, particularly this issue of how to use closed historic church buildings within Church Planting Canada, which is the association of any denomination in Canada that we know is planting a church. And that gets us to about 25 denominations. We have no authority, it's not a covenantal, anything that sounds formal or scary, we try to avoid, and we say that our vision is to be the empty table around which the networks planting churches in Canada may gather. And we've just finished our 10th National Congress, and we had over 500 people represented in 42 denominations. Joel was speaking by video to our pre-conference with New Leaf Network. And it's just very, very exciting to have many of these same themes floating around within the context of new church plants. My personal passion is to do with these buildings. And as an Anglican, trying to create a central location and space between evangelical Canada and mainline Canada. And of course, Catholic Canada is a subset of that, but has its own navigation as well. So it's a great joy to be here, just connecting in. I love Zoom. We had the last big call we had like this was, as I mentioned just informally before, a thing called the Canadian Church Buildings Conversation. We've specifically been trying to bring people together who are facing the closure of many buildings and what to do with it. Just give you one example by wrapping up. Robert Dalgleish is somebody you may know from the United Church of Canada. They did a survey within the United Church to say, how are you doing? Are you open for some new ideas? That kind of thing. And they discovered almost by accident that something like a third of their churches believed that they were facing imminent closure within the next 5 years, the closure of that congregation. And that has led that team called the EDGE team to looking at all kinds of new things to do with their buildings. So this mixture of new church plants as well as how are things doing now has really been a mainline thing. It's been very exciting. But probably where it went crazy for me was when I went down to see the Southern Baptist Convention in Alpharetta, Georgia. I'm talking like armed guards in the, was pretty crazy. And they said, hey, we are planting 1,000 churches next year. But we're also closing 1,000 churches. And I thought, this is now where things get really, really fun. And so it's a great joy to be with you. And those are some of the things we're working on.
Great, thank you. Carolyn, would you like to try speaking again? I'll unmute you. Okay, now go ahead.
Okay, does that work?
Yes.
I'm Carolyn Herbert. I live on a farm. I'm a lay leader in the church, and just small church. We have 2 unique congregations that we meet morning and afternoon, totally different groups that gather. Same service, but yeah, just this is really something that's close to my heart as a lay leader in the church.
Great, thank you, Carolyn. Todd, would you like to introduce yourself? There you go, you're good to go.
Oh, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, I'm Todd McDonald. I'm the senior pastor in Sundre with the Nazarene Church. Been with the Nazarene Church in ministry about 18 years. Just moved back here to take over the church here in leadership, and the church itself was kind of stagnant and not really growing at all. In fact, it was going the wrong way. We've taken on a look to see if we can flourish basically in our community by hooking up with the other churches in the area, really working with each other, and trying to get some excitement built back up into the town. But we also came here from Nova Scotia. We came here with 50 online as well, because we did a church plant in Nova Scotia. And the online aspect of the church has now grown to over 300. So we've got a small congregation, but we also have a worldwide presence as well. But we just want to make more of a presence in our community, which is why we're looking to Flourish for ideas, suggestions, and some new ideas going forward.
Great. Thanks, Todd. And Mitch, do you want to say hello?
Microphone.
There you go. Okay.
Me handle the unmuting, okay, please. All right, so I'm Mitch. I'm a neighbor of Sarah's here in Calgary. I'm giving her technical support on some of her Zoom calls. I'm also on the board of the Calgary Unitarian Church, and we're interested in church buildings too. So even though I was thinking I'd just here to make sure the bits and bytes flew around the way they're supposed to, I'm definitely interested in the topic.
Great, thanks,
That's
Mitch.
me.
Thank you. And Susan, I'm not sure if we can hear you now. You want to try?
Susan just put an introduction on the chat, Sarah.
Okay, great. All right, Joel, we'll turn it over to you, and perhaps you can start to walk us through our first topic.
Absolutely. We'll try to focus our time. I'm going to give a Coles Notes version of some things here, but part of our research involves, well, I'll say there's 3 phases to this initial project we're working on. Last year, we went coast to coast from Vancouver to Halifax, and we interviewed 115 leaders in Catholic, mainline, and conservative Protestant settings, conducted a number of focus groups in there as well. And what I'm going to share today is some of our learnings and findings from that project. And it really sets us up for something that we will launch this January for a national congregational survey. We're looking to survey church leaders as well as congregants across the country, regardless of size, regardless of location, urban, rural, and so forth. And so this will be a little bit of a plug that if you're interested in either having your own congregation or others within your network or denomination to be part of that survey, send me a note or email, and would be happy to add you to our list. Flourishing congregations at ambrose.edu, and happy to connect, follow that. And then the third phase of this project is to do in-depth case studies in congregations where we spend more time on the ground, again, across the Christian spectrum, attending services, conducting interviews and surveys with members across the congregation and so forth. So that's the preamble. What I want to share today are a series of variables that leaders have indicated to us are traits within their own congregations that have contributed to their own flourishing, or I would say sociologically, things that perhaps they think they aspire toward in what counts or doesn't, if you will, as a flourishing congregation. So everything I shared today are based on leader perceptions. They, in some respects, capture an ideal type of, in the perfect world, here's all the things you would see within a flourishing congregation. And so you can interpret those things for what they are within those settings. And then last, I would say, for any congregation that flourishes, it's important to know that there are both institutional and contextual variables. There are things that you control, and then there are things beyond your control that make a big difference. Things like immigration, birth rates, immigration, those kinds of things. All the things I'm going to focus on today deal exclusively with the institutional factors, things that religious groups can control directly. So I want to begin with an overarching category of what we call organizational ethos. A few variables about religious organizations that stood out to leaders that we spoke to. The first is a clear self-identity. I would say that congregations who are flourishing or say that they're flourishing are crystal clear on where they've come from, where they are, and where it is that they are going. And we could, I'm sure, brainstorm around the group here of different areas of focus whereby a congregation could anchor its identity. But I would say we heard a range of stories from congregations who said, we are an intergenerational congregation, and these are the things that we are anchoring ourselves and our identity in, to things about we want to be a diverse and inclusive community, however defined, to we are an urban congregation who is working with those who live in condos. You may have seen the latest data come out last week, how more and more Canadians are living in condos, particularly in larger urban centers. So whatever those identity pieces are, congregations that are flourishing are crystal clear in their identity and the things that they aspire to be, and that guides much of their ministry life. Second aspect of organizational ethos has to do with leadership. I could say all kinds of things about leadership, but I would say there is an organizational culture that supports and equips its leaders in developing their leadership skills, creating spaces and places for them to develop those areas. There is a strong commitment to leadership development. I would say that congregations that are flourishing are intentionally giving space and time to training and equipping the next generation of leaders, such that every aspect of ministry life, from the pulpit to children's and youth ministry to insert whatever you want into that, that leaders are intentionally cultivating and building leaders within the various ministry areas. And I think this is really essential for organizations to flourish short and long term as they invest in the next generation of leaders. We hear narratives of spirit-led leadership, and you can unpack that in a variety of ways, but I would say there's a sense that those who are leading congregations that are flourishing are in tune with the heart of God and are themselves people of prayer, of the word, of worship, and so forth. And then last component of leadership, that we have strategic leaders. People who understand and think about the decisions that they make today, what impact will that have on the next generation? And I would say that many of the decisions that are made in such congregations have this lens to say, we're not just making short-term decisions, but we're trying to think about whether it's what we do with our building, to what we do with our next hire, to how we spend our money. How will this impact the next generation, and how does this contribute to the long-term sustainability of this organization? Third aspect of organizational ethos that we came across was innovation. And I would say this is very much where the title came from for today, of Faith Communities with Nothing to Lose. There was a sense for some congregations where they were either on the verge of closing their doors, or things were moving in a downward trajectory, whether by numbers or overall morale, etc., that they had nothing to lose, and therefore were very open to innovative and entrepreneurial ideas. And so we heard all kinds of examples of congregations who tried new liturgical styles, who poured finances into trying a new ministry initiative without knowing what would actually happen there, purchasing multiple properties to expand their influence within a community and open different social service type organizations as an extension of their buildings and congregations. But I would say at its core, congregations that are flourishing are innovative and entrepreneurial. And that looks differently in different congregational settings. And it's really important to know that. You don't need to try what they did down the road, either in that church or across the country, but what is potentially an opportunity within your own congregational setting to say, we're going to try something new for us, a bit of a calculated entrepreneurial initiative relative to your identity. Who is it that you are trying to be and become as a congregation? And that becomes a bit of a filter to shape those things. Last thing I'll say about organizational ethos, and then we'll pause and maybe open up for some questions or discussion, has to do with structures and processes. Whether you like it or not, religious organizations are organizations. And organizations that function well have clear structures and processes that enable it to thrive in the short and long term. So whether it's someone who comes to your religious group for the first time, what's the process by which they become more and more involved within your congregation? What kind of follow-up happens? How do you encourage members to become more committed over time to your organization? I would say that congregations that are flourishing have clear structures and processes in place that help to walk newcomers through to those who have been around for 15 or 30 years within that church, to become entrenched within the subculture of that congregation. And they have structures and processes to help facilitate that. So I'm going to take a timeout on that. I'm happy to just open it up, given the size of the group. If you have questions or observations, if there are things that are resonating in particular, maybe you have your own stories or experiences of, yeah, we tried that and that worked really well, or we tried that and that was a miserable failure, and that was part of your learning process. So I'll pause for a moment and open for anyone who wants to speak into any of those items.
Yeah, so is anybody, if you have something you'd like to say, perhaps you could raise your hand, and you'll have the option along your screen to click hand raising, or you can just wave at us. Anybody want to jump in with a question or a resonance?
I'm always happy to jump in with the resonance, and I just love any time to be able to chat with Joel is just a great time, because I think it's just such beautiful research. To me, the big resonance in our context is we've been very clear in our model about the Alpha course. The Alpha course has been our clear, distinctive, and clear process that's given people a very clear way into church, and it's led us to ask sometimes, are we really a church, or are we just an Alpha course station? And that has been, for those of you who don't know, Alpha is a 10-week introduction to the Christian faith. It's actually been a really helpful exercise for us, because if we were just an Alpha course station, if that's all we were doing was running that course, there are quite a few things we would streamline. And of course, I'm asking that in a slightly polemical question, because of course we're a real church too. But it's helped us think. The other one on the entrepreneurial side, and back to the buildings, we've realized that unless you have a whole bunch of extraordinary donors in every situation, you've got to find a way to make that building work alongside purely faith-related ideas. And we've, the entrepreneurial venture for us has been to try to raise the standard of our building to be really a Montreal class conference center. And we have almost half of our revenue coming in from the use of our building in that way. So those have been some interesting things for us. The big question I have left as I continue to listen to Joel, and don't feel you have to answer it now, Joel, if you're going to come on to this, but is the transition. I mean, my belief is that in a lot of our churches, we cannot make the necessary transitions without closing congregations down. That's the focus of my doctoral work. And I would love to hear stories of where they've been able to make a significant enough turnaround without closing down. And also, for every turnaround we've seen, how many nosedives do we see in the attempted turnaround that didn't actually work? So there's a bit of a mouthful response.
Yeah, no, thanks, Graham. Let me say this by way of kind of a preliminary response. We heard this from a number of leaders who said, in order to flourish, and they really used this metaphor, that in order to flourish, sometimes things need to be pruned back or cut down or need to die altogether. And some spoke about this in a theological way, some in a sociological way, about what does it mean to die well? For some, that meant an entire church or organization. Sometimes it meant a ministry area. So when we talk about clear identity, for example, we heard congregations who said, you know, we have all these different programs. And as we clarify what our identity is, it meant that we actually need to stop these 5 programs because they don't actually help us to stay on course with the things that we're trying to do as an organization. There's many great things that are at work out there. And they actually talked about that as an important catalyst for their own flourishing, of learning to say no at an organizational level, no to the things that don't help them fulfill their identity, but then to say yes to give birth to new things. I would also say at an organizational level, that some of the congregations we've met with were ones that essentially had what we'd call a restart or a reboot. We're going to close down shop as it was once known, and we're going to start something new and fresh. And denominations have been really helpful in that. For some, denominations have provided funding for congregations to try new things, whether it pertained to space or programs or hiring, etc. That they had nothing to lose in some respects, and so we were going to try a series of new things. And so we've heard stories of, you know, entire buildings being donated from even one denomination to another congregation to start up something new. We've heard stories of denominations providing funding to local churches to try new and entrepreneurial things. And so you referenced the work with Edge, for example, in the United Church. I mean, there's some great things that are happening in different settings across the country there. So I'll kind of stop there, but some points of convergence for sure.
Okay. Any other questions or resonances? And if not, Joel can move on to talking about the second domain of flourishing congregations. Okay, Joel, why don't you move on and speak to the internal domain?
Sure. So we have the organizational ethos. This is one wing of flourishing. A second out of 3 areas of flourishing that we identify have to do with internal kinds of variables pertaining to congregational life. One, we would say, and this came up time and time again across traditions, Catholic, mainline, conservative, Protestant, was discipleship. This idea that congregations that flourish have a clear understanding of discipleship, and they have the processes and mechanisms to help discipleship within their church. Sociologically, I'll say this time and time again, the number one influence over a person's faith development is what happens within the home, between parents and children. And I would say that, and there's countless studies across religious traditions around the world, I would say when we talk about discipleship in congregations, congregations who understand this are helping to equip parents to effectively disciple within the home. And so whether it's providing an overlap between the sermon and what happens in Sunday school, along with a couple of questions that are noted in the bulletin for parents to have with their children sometime in the following week, that brings this ongoing mechanism and process whereby what's happening on a Sunday morning for both parents and for children to come into the fore within the home over the course of the week. And so we heard a number of different examples along those lines. Discipleship was front and center in congregational life. An active and growing spiritual life. I mean, you've all probably seen different kinds of studies on vital and healthy parishes and so forth. You can't have a religious organization flourish without its core purpose of religious and spiritual formation at its heart. And we would say that congregations that are flourishing have commented very positively on the ways in which their members are actively involved in a variety of spiritual practices, actively involved in attending religious services. The group component is really important to tithing, the Eucharist, the presence of the Holy Spirit and attentiveness to that, scripture, prayer, and so forth. And congregations come alongside in providing opportunities for members to grow in their faith, whether it's courses, whether it's book studies, whether it's resourcing for people in their spiritual formation. That an active and growing spiritual life is absolutely essential and in an ongoing way at the front and center of what they're doing as a congregation. The final thing I'll say about discipleship has to do with what congregation leaders talk about as a transformed life, right? How do you know when the spiritual life and discipleship is at work among your members? Many spoke about the lives that are transformed. And you can measure that in all kinds of ways. And this is part of the both the burden and the great opportunity we have as sociologists is to try to measure and articulate what does a transformed life look like. How do you measure when someone is more loving and patient and kind and generous, all those kinds of things. And I would say as much as measuring those things is valuable, we hear stories in congregations whereby they emphasize sharing stories with one another, and how that is an important tool and mechanism whereby you learn about the ways in which lives are being transformed. And so if I might think of my parents or grandparents' generations, and they would have like these, the classic testimony times in the middle of your service, and anyone can stand up and share what God's doing in their life or in their community, that these are actually really powerful sociologically for people to hear of the ways in which their lives and their communities are being transformed. And it feeds back into the group narrative then to say, okay, well, is this happening or not happening in my own life or in my neighborhood? And it has this feedback effect sociologically for group members. So discipleship overall, really important, and different things that come out of that. Second aspect of this internal focus, engaged laity. The more involved and engaged your laity are, I think there's a strong correlation with congregational flourishing. And I would say that those who we spoke to would say that there's a high level of commitment and involvement. People who are attending regularly, who take joy in attending their religious services, who tithe regularly, who participate in various levels of involvement in congregational life, of those who are volunteering. All of these kinds of things are imperative for organizations to flourish both in the short and long term. And congregations who are flourishing have been able to invite people in and to really leverage the engaged laity aspect of congregational life. Third, and probably related, hospitable communities. Congregations who flourish create spaces and places for people to become involved and to feel like they are loved and cared for within that. Sociologically, we know that the number one reason a person joins a religious group or a faith community is because someone they know in that group invites them into that particular community. And then in and through their social ties and networks, they become accepted over time by those who are part of that group. And so we heard a number of stories and examples, whether it's through coming first on a Sunday morning, coming to a program during the week where someone's been invited in. And I would say importantly, when we talk about those structures and processes, that congregations who have the mechanisms to help people work their way into congregational life seem to be far more effective in flourishing overall. And so I think of some congregations who have a clear process from the first time someone attends to inviting them to some kind of smaller social gathering within the first couple of weeks, whether it's with a paid church leader, a board member, someone else within the congregation, to invite them to volunteer in some kind of context or capacity. Different ways of drawing people into the community has been important. And the final thing I'll say on these internal dynamics and pieces is diversity. Congregations and leaders spoke to us about how diverse their congregations are, or really that this is an aspiration that a flourishing congregation should be diverse. And so here we heard different things about race and ethnicity. We heard things about gender, particularly in areas of leadership. We heard things about age diversity, things about social class, sexual identification and orientation. All of these variations, depending on denominational context, seem to be an important thing. And I would say what was a key catalyst for congregations that seem to be diverse is they build this into the narrative and they model this among their leadership, so that those who are in positions of church leadership reflect the kind of diversity that is either found within their church or emulates the aspirational goals of a congregation. So if you desire to be a multi-ethnic congregation, you can't have just a bunch of white leaders, right? You can't have, if you want to have a diversity along the lines of age, you need to have that represented within your senior leadership, as well as the cultivation of the next generation of leaders, etc. And so diversity, for many theologically speaking, was an important piece, either real or aspirational, that they said was integral for flourishing within their context. So to recap, at an internal level, we see things of discipleship and engaged laity, hospitable community, and diversity as things that were either present within communities or were aspirational in their pursuit of these things. So again, I'll pause and happy to open up for any questions, comments, feedback, or just your own experiences in any of these areas and domains.
Thank you, Joel. Lots of great stuff in there, really interesting. So any questions or resonances for folk as you're listening to what Joel is discovering through the research? I did have a question. I was intrigued by the whole role and importance of people being able to share their stories with one another. And I loved your reference back to the kind of, giving your testimony times and how that was a structure that enabled that in the past. And I'm just curious, what kinds of structures and processes do you discover that are contemporary in terms of how faith communities are creating those opportunities for people to share their stories with one another and kind of learn how, be familiar with one another's journey? Sure.
Great question. I think there's a number of ways we've heard this plays itself out. If I use the weekly religious gathering as one example, for some, they will embed what I would say, in some ways they're highly scripted, but in other ways they're not. But they'll have one or two members from their congregation, say on any given week, who will share a particular story or narrative of their own life that connects with the given theme for that week, whether you're following a liturgical calendar, for example, or whether you're more of a thematic focus within your congregation. So they'll have someone who'll come up and share a story or experience that connects with particular scripture reading. And so these are pre-planned, where the individual shares that. Others have the more impromptu settings where we'll just open up the mic and anyone who wants to come forward and share something of what God is doing in their life will have those. There are some congregations who create smaller group discussions as part of their weekly rituals. So they may meet in round tables and they may sing some songs, hear their church leader shares something from scripture, facilitate some prayers, and then in roundtable discussions, almost like smaller groups, people will share some of their own personal experiences as it relates to those given topics. And maybe last, I would say kind of your classic small group gatherings during the week, that churches are intentional to create opportunities for members to gather, where one of the purposes is to share their personal narratives and experiences in very concentrated ways relative to whether it's a book discussion group, etc., as well as other, like, I mean, we can go into online social media avenues where people are sharing stories through Facebook and other avenues and means as well. Would be kind of a prompter on some different ways we're seeing these things.
Right. Any questions or comments? Graham?
I'll pick up on that. One of the things I'm fascinated about is the attempt at suburban life that we've all been part of, and the amount of energy that's gone into suburban church. One of the things we believe we're seeing is hipsters don't like the suburbs. They want to be urban. And with the suburbs comes this large church model, or has come recently, the large church model. In that model, of all the things Joel just mentioned, the only one that I've heard of is the pre-packed testimony, the videotaped. They read a script because their story might not be that good, and I find that is like such an extreme case of the use of testimonies. It really helps show how much anybody under the age of 50 really, really hates that format. You know, they're just going, this is everything I really was like. They're not afraid of being told, don't sleep with your boyfriend, or you're gay, therefore you're not welcome. That they're so far past that if we try that, they just think we're idiots. You know, but pardon me if I'm stepping on somebody's toes, but this has been the kind of, you know, understanding how younger people are approaching church. Most of those methods, they're just not even going to come in the door. If they've come in the door and they hear the pre-packed testimony, their fears are confirmed and they leave very, very quickly. The other side is the truly open mic where anybody can walk in, and effectively the content has not been moderated at all. And in that case, boy, that can be quite scary. I find somewhere in the middle where there is genuinely the sense of, we genuinely don't know what's going to happen here, but there has been some structure. So we have some reason to trust what this person is about to say. And we've invited them to say what that is. That as mapped on against smaller churches, I think we've seen success in church planting partly because those churches are just smaller and people like smaller communities. So this testimony idea I'm very, very interested in, but in my mind it's very clear that the pre-packed big box version of it has no place in the generations coming that we're looking at now.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks, Graham. My response, and probably with everything that I've said today, it's really important to underline that, I mean, these things are certainly applied and manifest themselves in different ways in different congregational settings. And so I think what you highlight is the diversity of experiences among congregations. I think you're right. There are some settings where the prepackaged stuff would have no resonance, and we see that. But there are some where it absolutely has resonance and it intersects with a particular demographic. And so I think for all of us around the screen here, when you think about your own congregational setting, ask yourself, first of all, who are the demographics that are present in our congregation? What is our identity and what do we aspire to be? And how do these things help to facilitate, to help, or potentially even hinder our particular goals and objectives? And so you might find, you know, the classic testimony open mic is absolutely the way to go. And for others, you might find a bit more of a scripted thing because of the wild cards that can come with an unscripted might be appropriate, and perhaps some kind of hybrid in between. And I think the takeaway sociologically is to have hopefully enough of a cultural understanding of your own congregation to be able to say, okay, I think this might work. And if we bring it back to innovation, to try it, see what happens. And if it fails, I think this is something we've heard from leaders, they don't interpret failures as failures. These are just seeds for new ideas. And so we're going to try this. And if it doesn't work, then we pivot, and we have a congregational ethos that supports those kinds of things. And you might find testimonies don't work at all in your congregation, and have the courage to embrace that reality and move in a different direction to help facilitate the kinds of goals within that.
Great. Any other comments or resonances? If not, we'll move on to the final section of domains that Joel is going to speak to. Okay, Joel, would you like to speak around the outward domain?
All right, so the third and final aspect that we've identified have to do with things whereby congregations are looking outwards beyond the walls of their own congregation. And I would say more than anything we've talked about to this point, these were the things that congregations talked about the most, particularly the first variable here of neighborhood involvement. They said, if your congregation is not engaged within the community around, then you cannot be flourishing. These would be, I'm kind of paraphrasing what we're hearing from church leaders across the country, regardless of context, denominational or region. And so we just heard tons of examples whereby congregations were actively involved in their neighborhood around. And I could share many stories of helping those who live on the streets, to addicts, to single parents, to refugees, and you can insert all kinds of examples. But they were very intentionally and cognizantly engaged within their community and neighborhood around. And they saw that for some, it was a helpful turning point for them to flourish, in part because there was an awareness beyond their organization that they were there, that they made a difference within their community, and that they would say, if you ask the question, would our neighborhood notice if we were no longer here as a congregation? That most that we spoke to said yes, they would notice. And so they used that as a bit of a marker to evaluate how effective they were in outreach. So I would say congregations that aspire to flourish ought to be engaged within their neighborhood and community. Theologically, sociologically, much more that could be said there for sure. Second, evangelism. There was a commitment among many of the groups, again, across the continuum, who said that one of the important catalysts for their own flourishing was a refined commitment toward evangelism. And I don't know if this should have surprised us or not, but we were surprised to hear how central Alpha was across the board. We might have expected it within more conservative Protestant evangelical settings, but we heard this particularly in Catholic and in Anglican settings, whereby Alpha was a central tool and resource for congregations across the country. And it helped to draw, yeah.
Maybe for those of us that don't know all the language, Alpha?
Yeah, so returning to what Graham outlined earlier, is this, I believe, 10-week introductory course for people into the basics of the Christian faith. And it is something that started in London, UK, with Nicky Gumbel, and was very much oriented and premised towards those from outside the Christian faith who didn't know perhaps the ABCs of the Christian faith, but as we've seen over time, actually serves as a tool to also socialize, sociologically, socialize those within the church on the basics of the faith as well. And you find in a number of surveys that those who are sitting in the pews perhaps their entire life don't actually know many of the basics of the Christian faith. And so this dovetails with the whole discipleship program. And this is what we see, is that groups that are using this for evangelism purposes are also feeding that into their discipleship loop, their volunteering loop, their hospital community. I mean, many of the things that we're talking about today, this has been not necessarily a one-stop shop, but there's many points of convergence with some of the things that we're seeing today. So all that to say, evangelism has been...
Can I interrupt you for one quick second, Joel?
Yeah, please.
Just to add that the development of this thing began more than 30 years ago. And the first group to come and ask to co-develop it was the Roman Catholic Church. And they initially asked to develop their own, take the content and develop it outside. And the answer was, we would like to develop it with you, but we'd like you to develop the same one with us. So this multi-denominational global development project began, which the Alpha today represents that 30 years of cross-denominational work inside it.
Yeah, indeed. And we've seen a strong Catholic resonance with that, both in the discussion of the new evangelization narrative that you'll hear commonly within Catholic contexts. So I could say lots about evangelism. I won't for the sake of time, but just to say that that is an important piece of congregational narratives and training and equipping members within their congregation in reaching to those beyond their own context. And then last point for outward focus pertains to partnerships. Congregations having an understanding that by partnering with others, whether it's other congregations in their own denomination, by partnering in congregations of other denominations, of other religions altogether, of partnering with secular organizations or variety of social service agencies. There's a context that as congregations are clear about who they are and what they're trying to do, they can't do everything. And so they try to leverage themselves in the context of other networks that would help to broaden their overarching vision and mission as a congregation and within their communities.